Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'm bathing in that applause. I'm assuming that you're cheering for me and not for the event or the other participants in the great debate. I have to say, I'm just going to speak for just a minute or two before turning it over to our moderator, Hilary, Ilkay, to say I'm overjoyed at every part of this. The turnout is tremendous. I'm delighted that on the first day back from Reading Week, so many students have turned out for this. For those of you who are watching on the live stream, we have a rocking hall here. I know that sort of trips off my tongue, a rocking hall, a boisterous, raucous crowd. We're delighted to have all of you and those of you watching. This great debate is part of our year-long celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Foundation Year Program. So FYP at 50 is a cause for celebration for all of us, certainly everyone up here on the stage, the students, those of you who have been through the Foundation Year Program and are coming back as graduates, and those of you who are still currently students in the Foundation Year Program. This is a cause for celebration for all of us. And I was just saying to Hilary a couple of minutes ago, I really do feel enormous gratitude and warmth looking out into this room and seeing so many friendly faces from the past and the present, so many wonderful students who we've come to know and love from over the years. So this whole event is a source of tremendous joy and gratitude, at least from my point of view. So I'll just say one last thing, that Hilary is going to introduce the resolution that will concern us this evening and the rules and protocols that will govern the debate. I'll just say this, the two teams debating this evening are debating for the prestigious FYP Cup. Yeah, that's right. That's right. This is no small thing. They can share the cup and, between them, and think of the event over a morning coffee or tea. Parades, anything is possible. Anyway, thank you again for turning out for this hopefully tremendous event this evening. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Hilary Ilkay, to talk to you a little bit more about the event. Hilary.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Plot twist, I'm taking the cup. No, I'm kidding. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the great debate. It's thrilling to see all of you here. This is part of our FYP at 50 celebrations. They've been going on all year. They're going to keep going on after this event, so stay tuned for more. But this is truly an epoch-making event. I hope you feel the significance of what we're about to do here tonight. So my name is Hilary Ilkay. I'm an alumna of FYP and King's, and I'm a current tutor in the Foundation Year Program. So I am thrilled to be serving as your moderator this evening. I like this role because I get to remain neutral and tell people when to stop talking. My friend Simka, I don't know if Simka is watching this. He told me he would. If he's not, shame on him. But Simka told me that I was a biased moderator, which I find offensive. I am truly the paragon of neutrality and objectivity here tonight. So, oh, I forgot my sign. One moment. The resolution of the debate is as follows. Be it resolved that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the heart of the Foundation Year Program, FYP, and that all other works are simply footnotes to this great masterpiece. This is our resolution for tonight's debate. And our esteemed participants in this debate, sitting here before you, are divided into two teams, whom I will introduce according to their speaking order, and I will reintroduce them before they speak. So on the side of Pro-Gilgamesh, we have, yes. This is, okay, but now you have to listen to what I'm about to say. We have FYP faculty, Dr. Tim Clarke. We have FYP students, Elle, Crilly, and Henry Thiessen. Wow. Honestly, this is like the highlight of my popularity or feeling appreciated. This is thrilling. And we have King's faculty and Basso Profundo legend, Dr. Neil Robertson. Now on the opposing side, the side of anti-Gilgamesh, we have FYP students, Jonah, Leibu, and Leah Haines. And we have our beloved FYP faculty, Dr. Maria Euchner and Dr. Tom Curran. You are exceeding my expectations already. You're doing a remarkable job. So the event will proceed as follows. The pro-Gilgamesh side will deliver their opening remarks. We will then proceed in the order that I stated above. You know, the anti-Gilgamesh side will then deliver their rejoinder. Each speaker will have 8 to 10 minutes to make their case and respond to the other team's arguments. I will warn each person when they're approaching the upper 10 limit mark with this beautifully constructed, sophisticated sign that I made. I'll wave it frantically here. If need be, I will run in front of the podium. I will make myself known when you have 2 minutes to go. I will be timing you. So after all of the speakers have concluded their remarks, you, the audience, will have the chance to pose questions to the speakers in order to help you make this extremely important high-stakes decision that is your responsibility to make. Once the question and answer period has concluded, the time will come to determine the winner, which will be determined by measuring audience applause and general noise level. So what you've been doing, this is how we will decide the winner. I will then, well, actually, Dr. Brandis will award the winning team the prestigious and vehemently sought after FYP Cup aforementioned, and the resolution will be settled once and for all here tonight. Yes. Now, some quick housekeeping matters. If you are on the live stream, hello, please mute your mics. And if you're here in the room, please mute your mouths by reducing your chatter, because we have a lot of mics around and we don't want them to pick up the sound. So when we have people speaking, please just quiet yourselves. The time for noise will come, but is not now. Also, if you're on the live stream, this is being recorded. So if you want to turn your camera off, please feel free to do so. It's going to be recorded though. So you can all rewatch this every day, if you so wish, to bask in the glory of this event. So without further delay, let the great debate begin. Yes. Because I am an unbiased narrator, I will not remark any further except to say that first up on the side of Pro-Gilgamesh is Dr. Tim Clarke. Tim, you have 8 to 10 minutes, beginning when you utter your first word.
Okay. Hello. God, you are an intimidatingly large crowd. Friends and esteemed colleagues, we gather here this evening to consider a resolution that may seem at first thought to strain credulity, to throw into disrepute our good names and reputations, and to earn from the more benevolent among you a concerned and pitying shake of the head. How could it be that a program that devotes multiple days to the visions of Homer's Iliad, Dante's Commedia, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse could have at its beating heart a poem whose true name we do not know, whose text was first rediscovered only 170 years ago, and that we possess only as a collection of fragmentary tablets rescued by chance from the amnesia of history? It is, after all, a poem that literally no one we have read in the fifth year thus far could possibly have been influenced by directly. And yet, chancing ridicule and dishonor, we proclaim that here is the very foundation of foundation year, and whatever else we find, we will have found its precedent in Gilgamesh. Now, this is not to say that the only thing that matters is this text, but that it is a material that all else that follows cannot help but elaborate. And we say so because this text poses for us in barely 100 pages, full of gaps and holes, the most enduring human problem: how to navigate between the infinitude of our desires and the finitude of our powers. There's a chasm there that will not close. And that is our story, precisely because it's the story of what is least divine in us: our limitations, our fears, and our anxieties, our inability to have what we want when we want it. Gilgamesh may be 2/3 God, but everything meaningful and legible about him is that he is 1/3 human. And this 1/3 is his share in human finitude. This 1/3 is his share in us. This means, of course, that Gilgamesh, though he can defeat Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, cannot best death and must return empty-handed from his quest for immortality to the city of Uruk. Now, all of this is just to say that Gilgamesh is our most profound meditation on the meaning of that most significant human experience, one that I happen to have an immense depth of expertise in, if you'll forgive my bragging: the experience, of course, of failure. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the great poem of not getting what you want. Do you have right now everything you've ever wanted? No? Then Gilgamesh is your guy, and he's your only guy. It's all the more appropriate then that the reader of Gilgamesh doesn't get what they want. That where we desire a story in full, there are only the overheard scraps of a conversation long forgotten, its final meaning ever deferred and bracketed by what we do not and cannot know about it. So we advance tonight's resolution not in spite of Gilgamesh's textual complications, but precisely because of them. As all of you who have done FYP will know, this is nothing but a literalization of what we undertake every single time we read something. A poem is like a tent. You didn't make it, but it's no good to you if you can't set it up. I say this as an avid avoider of camping. And Gilgamesh teaches us this fundamental lesson about reading early on. Every version of this text is more than an interpretation, an act of conjuration, of building up a world out of fragments. So this poem teaches us not just how to read, but what reading is. All reading is a kind of writing. We don't simply open to the first page of a text and extract a vision of the world fully formed like plucking an apple from a low branch. We would assign fewer essays in FYP if this were the case. The reader is always half a writer, and nowhere are we more compelled to confront this fact than in Gilgamesh. If it's full of holes, so much the better that we learn this essay, that we learn this lesson early on. Freudian slip there. All texts are, and these holes are how we get inside. So everything meaningful there is to say about Gilgamesh or Dante or Woolf is calling into the gaps some notion and narration that might plausibly fill them. But if Gilgamesh is the story of limitations and finitude, of gaps and holes, it doesn't just leave us there. It's also the story that prescribes for us the one, only, and often very bitter medicine for human smallness, and that is culture. And culture begins from the shared life, the life with others, the life that we are participating in right now, the life where you are completed in the people who you aren't. Gilgamesh tells us that culture is immortality for mortals. If we can't live forever, at least we can be together. Does it sound cliche? Well, of course it does. You've heard it a million times before, but every cliche remembers a time when it was young and cool and new and perhaps even true. So if this notion seems like a platitude, it's only that we've been mulling it over in one form or another for 4,000 years. But in Gilgamesh, we get it hot off the presses, fresh baked in the clay. Which brings us to writing. Why does Gilgamesh insist on recording his deeds when he returns without the plant of immortality? So that he does not die, though he must. Because language which has no meaning except in a culture, a world of others, has a long memory, and the tablet longer still. In her 1993 Nobel Prize lecture, the novelist Toni Morrison declared, quote, "We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language, and that may be the measure of our lives," end quote. This, of course, is what Gilgamesh too would like us to learn. It is very old, but we have never gotten over it. And so, if we understand the insights of Gilgamesh, a finite person stung by love and loss, striving by any means to devise an infinitude beyond his mortal grasp, we've already glimpsed some part of what is profound in Sophocles, in Sappho, in Augustine, in Dante, in Marlowe, in Rousseau, in Shelley, in Dickinson, in Eliot, in Woolf, and most importantly, in ourselves and yourselves. And so, for these reasons and more, we urge you, friends, dearest friends, each and every one of you, to affirm the resolution before us tonight that Gilgamesh is the very heart of FYP, and all subsequent texts, striking though they may be, new though they may seem, are but fascinating footnotes to these fragmented and scattered tablets.
A strong start from the Pro-Gilgamesh team. In my capacity as neutral and objective moderator, I'd just like to point out that Tim has succeeded in some very important ways in his life. Be it resolved. Okay. Don't put me in front of a microphone. So on the anti-Gilgamesh side, to start off the remarks, we have from among your current FYP class, Jonah. Oh, don't worry. I am also timing you. And begin.
There's no such thing as an objective heart or high point in FYP, but even if there was one, it definitely wouldn't be Gilgamesh. Yeah, I'm going to do both parts of that statement, and then I'm going to get, at the end, I'm going to get into a bit of rebuttal to everything we've heard so far from Dr. Clarke. So, first, the no high point part. Let's take a step back. As much as like we read these books in order, that's not how we connect to them. Like Kant wasn't in the back of the A&A writing out his little spiel while we were reading Dante, right? We got all of the books at once, and more importantly, we read all of the books with the knowledge of the now, right? Like, how many of you, when you were reading Frankenstein, were thinking of the like, it's alive thing, you know? There's something in the culture by which we access it. And also, more importantly, the way we read these texts doesn't just come from Gilgamesh, it comes from all of these innovations later on. The reason that we talked about class in our Gilgamesh lecture, or we talked about feminism in our Gilgamesh lecture, is basically because we're looking ahead and back projecting the ideas of a lot of these texts onto the earlier texts. So what I'm saying is that as much as it might seem like FYP is a chronological thing where we get to each thing in order, that idea totally falls apart once you take a closer look at it, much like most of my essays. Really, the way this works is that we have to take FYP as a whole because that's how we access it. This was put a lot better by a quote I saw, and I promise this will be the most pretentious part of my speech. It's by Jorge Luis Borges. He's a very famous novelist, and he says, and I quote, "The word precursor is indispensable to the vocabulary of criticism, but one must try to purify it from any connotations of polemic or rivalry. The fact is that each writer creates his precursors. His writings modify the past as well as the future." And that's really important to how we understand FYP, because the writings of everyone we read are modifying the past as well. So it makes no sense to speak of a heart or a high point of FYP because we have to take it all at once. But let's say you don't buy that. First of all, hurtful. I spent a lot of time on that. Although I did write quite a bit of it very sleep deprived on the bus back from the plane this morning. So blame that if it didn't make a ton of sense. Even if you're dead set on finding a heart and a high point of FYP beyond like your personal preference, you want to look at a text and say, this is actually definitely the best one. I'm going to tell you that choice should absolutely not be Gilgamesh. And why is this? Because Gilgamesh himself is flat and unrelatable, and so are the themes of the text. And yeah, obviously this is going to like go directly against a bunch of stuff that Dr. Clarke said. Look at me. I'm someone. I had a childhood, I have feelings, I have takes on like Crilly and then the TV shows that I'm watching right now. Is Gilgamesh someone in the same way? Does he have a personality other than like being strong and kind of homoerotic with his friend? Like anyone in this auditorium, you could sit down for an hour and have a chat at the Wardy with. I don't think that you could have that chat with Gilgamesh. He's not that rich a character. And because of that, all of the themes fall flat because we don't just read these texts for the sake of it. We read them because the themes have to be relevant to our lives. And if you can't see yourself in Gilgamesh as a character, his struggle is going to be so much less impactful than the more fully fleshed out characters that we're going to get later. But of course, my opponents might respond with something along the lines of Gilgamesh might be flat, but the theme of death isn't, and the struggle against death isn't. And I'm just going to say, like, I don't buy that the struggle against death and the struggle against failure is that definitional to our lives as FYP students. Like, I've been around this campus. I see people who drink chocolate milk on tap, who smoke between the breaks of lectures, who stay up absurdly late writing during FYP Mondays, right? Is that the behavior of people who are concerned about the fact that they're going to die at some point? Like, no, it's absolutely not. We live our lives as a thing of joy about the life, and death isn't important just because it's at the end of it. Like, my favorite movie is Good Will Hunting, and I promise you it's not because of the credits, it's because of the stuff in the middle. So, like, I'm just gonna go for another anecdote, because I was checking my screen time yesterday, and it was really depressing. I spend way too much time on Instagram. But it's useful in this scenario because I'll tell you, I spend way more time on Instagram than I ever do like sitting out the window pondering the meaning of life, you know? Like, by show of hands, who here would say they use social media more than they ponder the fact that they're going to die on a daily basis? That's great. I'm really glad you all raised your hands because I had noted down in my notes, like, if they don't raise your hands, that's not going to work well. So the theme of death isn't that relatable as much as Gilgamesh isn't relatable. But the cherry on top of this cake of unrelatability is that the essay, or the epic's like solution to the fear of death also isn't relatable to us, right? None of us are going to go out around Halifax and start building a big wall with our name on it and then telling people to write that fact down. For one, there's a lot of water around this city, so it would probably sink. But two, and more importantly, like, we're not kings. We don't have that kind of power, at least most of us, right? Gilgamesh's solution to the fear of death is that at some point you might be lucky enough and rich enough and famous enough to be like important enough to be remembered. But what does that say for us, the people who might not be like that, who live normal lives, lives that aren't going to be written down in history books, but are still important? Gilgamesh's solution to the fear of death is so out of reach to the kind of life that we're going to live. And as such, its whole solution isn't relatable either. And look, the one thing that you could say that I did find relatable about Gilgamesh was like the homoeroticism. But because like I had friends who were jocks in high school and they flirted with each other all the time, but all of our FIP texts are homoerotic, so that doesn't count. So in conclusion, you shouldn't buy into Gilgamesh because it's unrelatable, the themes are unrelatable, and the solution is unrelatable. So I'm going to restate, there is no such thing as an objective high point in FIP, but if there was one, it wouldn't be Gilgamesh. And I'm also going to get, oh, I'm not done yet, guys. I've got another little bit. I'm going to go through my notes from Dr. Clarke's speech and tell you what I thought was wrong. Right. So look, I think that at the base, they have to defend the things that are unique about Gilgamesh, right? Like, they can't come up here and tell you Gilgamesh is special because it's about the fact that we don't always get what we want. A bunch of FIP books are about the fact that we don't always get what we want, right? Like, Aeneas doesn't get what he wants, Frankenstein doesn't get what he wants. And likewise, I think it's a bit rich to say, like, it's important because it's fragmented. So many of the books that we get are fragmented. They need to defend the things that are unique about Gilgamesh. So every time they say something that like seems to you to be very impactful about Gilgamesh, I just want you to ask yourself one question. Was this in any other FIP book we read? Because if so, and I'll bet it was, that's not a good argument for the importance of Gilgamesh specifically. And on the point, yeah, so that's basically what I'll say to that. A bunch of the things that they identify aren't unique to Gilgamesh. They can't make it the high point of FIP. And as such, I just think that the only real thing that Dr. Clarke's speech brought to us that is unique about Gilgamesh is, again, this theme about death, this concern about how are we going to live our lives given the fact that we die. But again, I told you, that's like not that important. Sure, it might be in like your top 10 concerns, but I'm sure it's not like top of the line in the same way that all of these FIP texts are. So one more time, there isn't a high point, but if there was, it wouldn't be Gilgamesh. Thank you.
Wow. A rousing start on the anti-Gilgamesh side. This is thrilling. Next up, from the pro-Gilgamesh side, we have another student from your current FIP class here to defend Gilgamesh. Leah, please. Elle. Y'all, it's been a long day. All right.
All right. That's a tough one to follow. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Wow, thank you for coming. This is a way better turnout than like any FIP lecture I've ever been to. So thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Okay, I'll start off with a question. Have any of you ever considered what the word foundation in the program's title is referring to? Because I hadn't until I was asked to do this debate. I propose it's the stable basis from which all the texts we read grow from. Surprise, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Do you agree with me when I say, and feel at liberty to answer out loud, that we read way too much in this program? What would you say? Yeah? Well, what if I told you you only had to read one text in the entirety of fifth? I know it sounds absurd, but you know what's even more absurd? Reading when you don't really have to. Yeah. The tutors are misleading you to believe you have to read all these texts, especially Tom and Maria. But the Epic of Gilgamesh is the only text you ever have to read. I'll leave this here with you for a second to digest and switch gears and talk about the fact that as students, we are so heavily advised against plagiarism, and yet all of the footnotes we read are merely poor reproductions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. A classic example is the Old Testament, arguably. It's arguably one of the most famous and influential texts worldwide, and yet it literally stole all of its content from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the spirit of Lent, I gave up bullshit. So I do hesitate to be so blasphemous during this religious celebration, but this really is straight up plagiarism. The Epic's accounts of the garden and the Great Flood are found exactly within the Old Testament. Remember that snake that sabotages both Eve and Gilgamesh? And plus, like, both texts are obsessed with the number 7, but the Epic was obsessed with it first, so. Anyways, we should think of the Epic as an all-encompassing text that everything else proceeds from, instead of disconnected pieces found at random within texts that succeed it. Sure, we don't have access to all of it, but we should not dismiss it based on its fragmented nature. Sure, some people literally dug it up out of the ground. I don't know what they're called. I've only ever read one text. However, it does not detract from its significance. Unfortunately, Roberta Barker beat me to this point this morning for those of you that went to the lecture, but Sappho and Emily Dickinson are even more fragmented than Gilgamesh, and we still love them. So I don't really see what the big deal is here. If it was about, if it was about the fragmentedness of the works, we wouldn't read anything in the handbook. It's clearly not about completed works, but completing the works together like some kind of giant FYP puzzle. The meaning of what we read is beyond the literal. Language nearly always points beyond itself. Imagine if St. Augustine got his hands on the Epic of Gilgamesh before the Bible. Wouldn't that be crazy? What Augustine shows in his Confessions, Gilgamesh did first and in a much more epic fashion. This guy's radical conversion was just a medieval teenage diary. Not to say that's a bad thing, but Gilgamesh had a journey into the depths of the underworld to discover his finitude, which is way cooler. And ultimately what we recognize, St. Augustine does too. And Dante as well. I know that Tom is gonna try and tell you that Dante is the Divine Comedy is the height of the FYP program. But in considering parallels between these two texts, isn't one just way longer and confusing than the other? Like, it's just way worse to read. Anyways, the point is here that to dig out meaning requires toil, some decent tools, and ideally each other. Coincidentally, also, if you think about it, so does building a foundation. In other words, so much of what enriches us is attempting to hold a space for the value of something beyond what we cannot immediately see, journeying into the underworld, if you will. Sure, Dante adds some cool stuff, I'll give him that. But exile me or anyone else in this room for 2 years, and I'm sure we could come up with something just as good, so long as we had the Epic of Gilgamesh. Although the language itself is fragmented, the message behind it is ever present. We just need to learn how to access it. And so the role of Dante and all the other footnotes essentially teach us that everything is much simpler than it's made to be, and it's all in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The epic is like a thread that holds together the beads of everything we read to make some kind of like beautiful FYP necklace, I guess, which is not a bad merch idea. You guys can use that one for free because ideas should be. People criticize FYP for being a pretentious person points club, but in reality, sorry. But in reality, it's more than that. It's not the quantity of the text you read, but rather the ability to critically engage with these works and search for the complexity and nuances in the simplest of themes and stories. It's about the strength of the thread, not how many beads you have on it. Because at the end of the day, we're all just leaving with one thread, and that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. I'd like to render FYP even more quote unquote useless and say that we should spend all year just on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Not as a means to an end or an awesome necklace, but rather an end in itself. The amount of text we read will not help us to necessarily know thyself any better, but it is the depths, the literal depths into the underworld that we must go to access this self-knowledge. Although we may not all agree on notions of timelessness and universality like Marx, we can agree, except for Jonah, that there's an unexplainable connection to Gilgamesh. Spending an entire year in the epic would help us to do more than scratch the surface, allowing us to excavate these texts more thoroughly and collectively encounter each other and ourselves in various ways, in ways I'm not really sure we can in this dangerously ambitious program. I'd like to conclude with the words of Daniel Brandis, who perfectly sums up the foundation year program. The aims of these far-reaching wanderings in space and time, the true end of our exploring, is not to arrive at the knowledge of something new and strange and mysterious. On the contrary, our journey will return us to our starting place. Spending more time in the Epic of Gilgamesh allows us more time in a dimension that our current reality lacks, and arguably will never be able to achieve, a place where we can all connect. Not to say that we should restrict the footnotes. They have their own place in aiding our understanding and complicating themes that were already established in the Epic of Gilgamesh in important ways. But what actually draws them together is the epic's ability to act as like a mediator or a reference point that guides us through the footnotes. The Epic of Gilgamesh remains foundational, an awesome dimension of simple connections and endless questions, and extremely necessary for sustained conversation in a world where we are more isolated than ever. Ain't that epic and foundational? All right, go Gilgamesh. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Elle, because that is your name, and I said it correctly. I did not make a mistake. I am a perfect moderator. Next up, we have a name I have not said already. Leah, anti-Gilgamesh. Let's hear it.
All right. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Pretentious People Points Club debate. Thank you all for being here. It's a very large crowd. First, I'm going to start off with a bit of rebuttal. So the idea of the Epic of Gilgamesh being a foundation doesn't necessarily mean that it is the heart of FYP. I mean, we didn't read Kant's grade 11 essays, even though they were his foundation, because they were probably bad. So having it as a foundation, having it as the first text we read is a fine point. It's true, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the heart of FYP or that it continues through the rest of FYP. If it was not going to be the epic, it was going to be another text that started our foundation year program. So now I'd like to move back to my main contention. The claims that my opponent have made that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the heart of the foundation year program and that all other works are simply footnotes to this great masterpiece is, as Jonah pointed out, it does not reflect the reality of both literary history and our modern world. On top of this, it is an insult to the wonderful and amazing women writers and characters we study in the foundation year program. Writers like Hildegard, writers like Sappho, exactly. I do miss writers like Wollstonecraft and Shelley. These authors give us a worldview absent from the epic and allow a better understanding of the full truth of humanity. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, women play 3 roles. You might remember: harlots, wise truth tellers, and gods. While the latter of these 3 might seem fine or even desirable, all of these 3 categories of women play the same role, which is to serve men. So in other words, basically what I'm saying here is that Freud would have really enjoyed the epic. His views of women are super in line with it. They have no specific agency to themselves and simply act as vessels for the ambitions of men around them. They are characterized as having great influence over the men in the epic and by extension the plot, but influence over a man is not a substitute for actual power, and it's something the women never have in this text. Now, it's safe to say the majority of women in the FYP program don't fit into the 3 categories I laid out previously, except for Hilary, who is of course a god. Relating back to my teammate's point, this creates a divide between the average FYP student and the portrayal of women in the epic. The relationships between men and women in the epic are of another world, separated from our own in ways that cannot be reconciled by simply bestowing the title of heart to this text. The priestess Shamat, the only character in the epic who I would classify as a girl boss, sent to humanize Enkidu, teaches him about the world and society, yet we are never given any indication of her actual motivations. The services she provides, both sexually and in educating Enkidu, are presented in similar fashions that have necessity to the plot with no regard for her own understandings or feelings. When these services have been fulfilled, there is no longer a need for her as a character and we never see her again, which I personally, when I read the epic, was very sad about because she seemed very cool. While women in Sumerian society did have significantly more rights than in later Mesopotamian societies, they were still regarded as secondary to men. And I want you to know that when I first read that, I went, that sounds very familiar. As Mesopotamian society grew larger in both wealth and power, a patriarchal system came into play which prevented women from attaining the same heights and power. While it may be argued that because of this increased role women played in Sumerian society, the epic actually reflects a somewhat feminist take on women and womanhood. However, the many changes in the text over the years and the progression we of the world has made leave any empowerment for its women characters feeling hollow and stuck in a patriarchal worldview. The amount of text we read in the FYP program written by women is low. It's approximately 16%, and I actually did the math, so if you do want to check, you can, but it is correct. Taking a text like the epic and holding it up as the pinnacle of FYP allows for this gap of 84% to play an even bigger role in the imaginations of students, tutors, and the world at large. It is not until we reach the likes of Sappho, Hildegard, Wollstonecraft, Shelley, du Beauvoir, and Lord that we receive a more well-rounded view of the world from which we came and to which we are going. And is that not the goal of the foundation year program? To understand who we are and where we came from. It is true that the Epic of Gilgamesh plays a role in this understanding, but it is not the whole truth, and therefore it cannot be the heart. The ideals we hold in the modern day reflect a desire to allow women agency, power, and space in our academic circles. The claim that the heart of FYP is a text which does not allow women to have these roles is a grave mistake on our part. Thank you.
Well, my father is tuning into this debate remotely. Guess what, Dad? I'm a god. Next up, from the pro-Gilgamesh side, we have yet another of your brave FYP classmates, Henry.
Good evening. Good evening. It's a delight to be here. Thank you to the King's team and Thanks to all you for coming. Let me present two quotes from the internet. The first, may your hands be full of clay, your hearts full of imagination. Profound. The second, once paper is crumpled, it cannot be perfect again. Why do I read you these quotes? What possible bearing could they have on a debate as to whether or not all else in FYP serves as a mere footnote to the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, Jonah, Gilgamesh is the only thing one reads in FYP which was recorded on clay tablets. Stand correct. This year, the only thing we read in FYP, I'll say that again, is recorded on clay tablets. Perhaps there's no objective high point amongst the books written on paper, but we are discussing clay tablets. This side of the debate believes in tablet supremacy. I believe that what is written on clay is better than paper. I believe that tablets are better than books. To begin, let me read a quote from the mighty work of Gilgamesh itself. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh says, "My friend whom I loved has turned to clay. My friend Enkidu, whom I loved, has turned to clay. Shall I not be like him and also lie down, never to rise again through all eternity? Upon his death, Gilgamesh shall become clay, and he will remain this way for all eternity, for truly clay lasts forever." We observe a moment of self-aware brilliance in the work. The work tells us that what is written down on clay is great, partly because clay is immortal. As Gilgamesh itself is written down on clay, the work is thus greater than all else read in FYP. The work understands and verifies its own brilliance. It would make no sense for Gilgamesh to say such a thing and the epic to have been written down on paper, for Gilgamesh does not lie down to be turned into paper. QED. I say again, tablets are forever, books temporary and transitory. Books had their vogue for a few thousand years. They've already given way once again to the tablet, which has reasserted its primacy in modernity, albeit in a technologically updated form. For what are our e-readers and tablets, if not tablets? A study conducted of educators revealed that 81% of K-12 teachers believe that tablets enrich classroom education. When our side claims victory in this debate, expect the percentage of pro-Gilgamesh people in this room to hover somewhere around the 81% mark. Regardless, I anticipate the replies of those who remain defenders of paper. Gilgamesh, they will point out, comes to us on tablets which are fragmented and broken. This is evidence of clay's imperfect nature. I don't mean the tablets themselves are somehow impervious to damage, but that they are immortal and that what they record will remain as legend for all time. I'll revisit this in a moment, but for now, let me linger briefly on this point that the tablets of Gilgamesh are damaged and incomplete. Jonah, Leah, these people have come and said they've criticized the thematic content of Gilgamesh. Well, that's not a problem because if we had the tablets in their entirety, all objections would be resolved. It's already so great. If we had the full thing pieced together, one can only imagine what would be on that. What is written on tablets is great, timeless, for writing on tablets is the ultimate writer's tool. Only what is of great import and urgency can be written down on tablets, and writing on tablets forces greater deliberation over what precisely must be recorded. The Epic of Gilgamesh is recorded on a mere handful of tablets, but with those tablets, it conveys the most powerful story ever told of life, love, death, and friendship. One can only imagine the clarity with which FYP students would understand such thinkers as Hegel and Kant if these writers were forced to use tablets and think more carefully about what precisely they were trying to say. Because I don't know. If Descartes only had recourse to writing his thoughts down on tablets, then no one in FYP would even read the meditations, for I have full confidence that he would never have even bothered to write down such musings. Dante wrote during a time in which only the Lord knows the amount of marble that was being used in Florence, be it he never saw in the Inferno something of worth enough to be inscribed on the pearly stones. We also read Robespierre and the writings of the French Revolution in FYP, though the French Revolution's sole obsession, it seems, was with dismantling old buildings. We found no bricks taken from the Bastille with which anything of worth is inscribed on it. This casts serious doubt on the revolutionists' claim that they wanted the new France to last forever. In conclusion, to posit any book other than Gilgamesh as the ultimate FYP book is to defend the primacy of paper, which is an ugly position. Clay is immortal. It brings out the greatness of its writers and demands intentionality from them. I repeat the quotes that I read at the beginning. May your hands be full of clay, your hearts full of imagination. And once paper is crumpled, it cannot be perfect again. Thank you.
This is a stirring debate. All right, we are entering into the portion of the night where now a few FIP tutors will be speaking. Do not make me wave my sign at you. All right, on the anti-Gilgamesh side, we have your very own FIP tutor, Dr. Maria Euchner.
Thank you very much. Henry, tell me, what form did your version of the Epic of Gilgamesh come in the bookstore? Did you get it in clay? They do? Oh, they didn't. They ran out. Shame. Anyway, so I would like to begin with what we're doing in the foundation year program on a daily basis, namely a close reading of a part of the resolution, namely the footnote to which everything that follows the epic has been reduced. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a footnote as, quote, a thing that is additional or less important, unquote. Can Emily Dickinson's poetry really be described in good faith as serving as an addition to the depiction of Gilgamesh's slaying of Humbaba? And is it really less important? Aye, there's the rub, to quote Hamlet, presumably yet another footnote to Gilgamesh, for who is to judge? Footnotes perform a referential function, and as such tend to lack autonomy. While nothing comes from nothing, that is, nothing emerges in a vacuum or in isolation, individuals, society, and culture evolve and develop a life of their own. In order for growth to take place, the old eventually needs to be left behind, like a tree shedding its browned leaves in the fall so that new ones can grow in the spring. The Epic of Gilgamesh is like the seed of that tree. As new leaves grow every spring, each unique and wonderful in its own way, new, unique, and wonderful literary iterations have grown from the epic. So, like a seed, the epic should be considered a beginning. It is a beginning of a literary culture. It is a beginning of the material evidence of a literary culture. It is also the first of many journey narratives that we encounter throughout the foundation year program. Perhaps most poignantly, it marks the beginning of every FIP student's journey through the curriculum. A good travel narrative is always dialectical in nature, and the physical journey is the external reflection of the inner journey. As the traveler encounters the big O other, whether it be in the constellation of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, Achilles and Hector, Frankenstein and his creature, or a FIP student or tutor and material that they're uncomfortable with, the idea is to learn and grow as a result of that encounter. And hopefully, that will open up more doors for new and even stranger encounters. If and when the traveler returns home, they return a different person, and their experiences affect and inspire those they interact with at home, so that change is inevitable. If the epic were indeed the high point or the heart of FIP, why would one ever read any of the subsequent texts? What growth could possibly be expected? The FIP journey is teleological and not just chronological, and that means that the epic is a starting point and provides the matrix of many more wonderful and increasingly more sophisticated things to come. Allow me to use an analogy of art to illustrate my point. As far as we're aware, the first expressions of human art are to be found in the caves of southern Germany, France, and Spain. And while they're magnificent, I don't think anyone could argue convincingly that the imaginative sea and landscape paintings of J.M.W. Turner or the exquisite David by Michelangelo, or the gruesome depiction of Judith slaying Holofernes by Artemisia Gentileschi, are mere footnotes to 40,000-year-old cave art. Art and literature are reflections of communities in specific moments in time, and each literature reflects very specific temporal, geographical, political, and religious contexts. In the case of the epic, the historical context is that of ancient Mesopotamia, and this particular text is simply one that ended up surviving. Think of all the texts that have been lost or destroyed. Different times, civilizations, and cultures are characterized by different artistic expressions, each worthy of its own, in its own right. Measuring the epic against a text like Frankenstein is like comparing apples with cucumbers. We mustn't forget that the epic is incomplete, and this has been mentioned before. So while it could certainly benefit from footnotes, they don't come in the form of the Divine Comedy or the Communist Manifesto. Until more clay tablets are found that might add some complexity, the epic's formulaic character, its numerous repetitions that want sophistication, and its blatant lack of subtlety all dictate that it can be no more than a starting point, no matter how exciting it may be in many other ways. The female characters, as my esteemed colleague has already mentioned, are mere instruments, no more than means to an end, and simply don't stand up to Virgil's Dido or the historical Elizabeth I, whose agency and defiance affected culture and cultures, both imagined and real. As the interaction between humans and gods grow less and less direct in the texts that we encounter in the course of FYP, the more psychologically sophisticated and therefore relatable the human characters become, to pick up on Jonah's point. And can this development convincingly be described as a footnote to the rather monodimensional relationship between the human and the divine, in which the gods ultimately have the upper hand? I think not. Aside from everything else that has been argued thus far, beginning FYP with the high point or with the heart would be a demonstration of pretty shoddy curriculum development. How could anyone be expected to see what follows? And finally, how great can the Epic of Gilgamesh be if the language that it's written in didn't even manage to survive? Thank you.
All right, folks. We're down to the final pair of speakers. Shh. Your time for noise is coming soon. The final pair of speakers, dare I say, their friendship rivals that of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. However, tonight, they are enemies in this debate to decide the resolution. So we will begin with the pro-Gilgamesh side, and that is represented by none other than Dr. Neil Robertson.
Thank you. I have just a few comments to make to try to flesh out a little bit of what is obviously the compelling argument in this whole debate. And I think it's perfectly clear that that our opponents have demonstrated, I think fairly conclusively, that they are Eurocentric imperialist climate change deniers. And the way I think this comes out most obviously is in their advocacy of the paper side of the debate. As Henry was making so clear, when you are choosing Gilgamesh, you are choosing tablets. Whether ancient tablets or modern tablets, the result is that we're not destroying the forests of Nova Scotia and the rest of the world. So if you want to be on the side of our university president, the Leahy report on forestry, you need to be on the side of pro-Gilgamesh, because we are those who are supporting the only way in which we can get beyond the destruction of our forests and save our planet now. And further, when Dr. Euchner made the points about footnotes. Well, she's not debating the Oxford English Dictionary. We have never spoken in this denigrating language of footnotes as somehow marginal and lesser, but really that they are appendages that depend upon the heart. The heart does not turn in denigration against the limbs that it is sustaining and supporting, just the opposite. And furthermore, what is this heart? What is this heart that is being denied by the opponents of this proposition? It is the text that arises not in Europe, not in the realm of the Mediterranean, but there in the beginnings of civilization in Asia and in the realm of the Mesopotamian world. And so what we are supporting and sustaining is exactly the need to see that Europe is really just a derivation of these much more fundamental roots, this much deeper heart. And so I would suggest that really every text that we look at in the foundation year program can be seen, just as our opponents have argued, to be simply repeating and commenting upon the fundamental themes that characterize the Epic of Gilgamesh. These questions of mortality, the question of permanence and impermanence, the question of how human beings can find a way to dwell in the world through a relationship with one another. The fundamental questions that arise in civilized life and in human life at its most basic foundation. And of course, I'm imagining that people might point out the small detail that the Epic of Gilgamesh lay buried under the earth for over 2,000 years, unread by anybody, and that this is somehow a convincing argument against us. I know that Dr. Curran pays attention to, well, what Samuel Johnson called the last refuge of a scoundrel, which is facts. That's actually not what Samuel Johnson said. That's not a fact. But the very nature of a foundation, in a foundation program, where do you find the foundation? It's buried underground. And upon it rises the superstructure that is the decoration, the footnotes, the limbs that are being fed by the heart that is still there hidden away. You don't want your heart exposed to the light of day. That's not a healthy thing to do. And so when we look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, let's just look at its themes. So we find in it, as we've already been arguing, themes fundamental to the Hebrew scriptures. But we find also the theme of friendship, that special relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, which is then simply reiterated in the friendship between Achilles and Patroclus. We find this sense of journeying, which is simply reiterated in the wanderings of Odysseus. We find the question of the restless heart. When Gilgamesh speaks about his restlessness, what is that but the very opening lines of Augustine's Confessions? We find that sense of, well, maybe you should just live your life as you find it, in the words of Siduri. Well, what is that but what is argued in the Enlightenment and in Hellenistic philosophy? We find that sense of entering into the underworld, but what is that but also what is found in Dante's Divine Comedy? We find everywhere in the foundation year program, but the themes, the music, that has been written in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And here we have the footnotes, the various comments, the ways of adumbrating that text. And it may well be that my opponents will be suggesting, for instance, that the very resolution of this debate is derived from another source. Alfred North Whitehead, the great philosopher who co-authored with Bertrand Russell, famously said that all of Western philosophy is but a set of footnotes to Plato. But you can understand why such a quotation has just got things wrong. What do you expect from somebody named Whitehead? This is the need to look deeper and find the real source of the footnotes that we call the Western tradition. And what is at the heart of the Epic of Gilgamesh? It's the story of a friendship, a moment of recognition, a moment of interconnection, which is found through struggle and opposition. What is this but Hegel's master-slave dialectic, realizing itself for the first time in literature? And what does this show us? But that what we have at work here is Geist, is spirit manifesting itself through the entire tradition. And an example of that sense of spirit manifesting itself came to me just yesterday as I was sitting at my computer. And as I was sitting at my computer, I got an email from the chaplain. And what the chaplain sent me, and to others on this list, was a poem I had never heard or read before, written by a Welsh poet in Welsh. But to my mind, it spoke exactly to the question we have before. So if you'll just allow me, I'm just going to read this. It's a beautiful poem. I just want to read it to you. One fleeting moment as the sun is setting, one gentle moment as the night falls fast, to bring to mind the things that are forgotten, now scattered in the dust of ages past. Like white foamed waves that break on lonely beaches, like the wind's song where no one hears the wind. They beckon us, I know, but to no purpose, the old forgotten things of humankind. The artistry and skills of early peoples, small dwelling places and enormous halls, old well-told tales that have been lost for ages, the gods that now no mortal could recall. Often at close of day, when I am lonely, I long to know you all, bring all to mind. Is there a heart or memory still to cherish the old forgotten things of humankind? And surely this is exactly the project of the Foundation Year Program, articulated for us in that desire to be recalled that the Epic of Gilgamesh concludes with when it says these words. This too was the work of Gilgamesh, the king who knew the countries of the world. He was wise. He saw mysteries and knew secret things. He brought us a tale of the days before the flood. He went a long journey, was weary, worn out with labor, and returning, engraved on a stone the whole story. So let's recall that story as the heart of the Foundation Year Program.
Friends, we have reached the final speaker of the night. Yes.
I started speaking now.
Okay, please welcome to conclude for the anti-Gilgamesh side, Dr. Tom Curran.
So I'd like to begin by making a few preamble comments. We may not get beyond them in my time. But the first thing that has to be said absolutely clearly is this side to my left is not anti-Gilgamesh. We're pro-Gilgamesh, but not in the sense of the resolution. And by the way, this is very useful. Post-Gilgamesh. It's as if one were saying, I don't know if you know this, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Yes, Virginia, there is something after Gilgamesh. That's really all we have to show. And Jonah, I'm hoping that Dr. Clarke will not be your tutor in the 6th section of the program. I'd like to remind those of you who are destined to become lawyers in Toronto, which I believe I have the statistic here, 37.8%. I hope you enjoy your life on the 50th floor of some horrible building in Toronto with no windows because you're going to be junior and artificial air. And that is something we should all strive for. I understand that completely. But in the context of this debate, I just want to point out, and Neil knows this better than anyone else, the defense doesn't have to prove anything. We just have to show that the case provided by the government here is not convincing and that it is not beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's no need for us on the post-Gilgamesh side to slag off the epic. It's not our job, just to say there's something else. Now, Super Bowl 51 was one of the life-altering experiences of my life. I left at halftime because the Patriots were losing 27-3, 28-3. And only in the 17th minute of regulation time left did they advance to 28-9, which left them with 11 minutes in the end to win the game. And the reason this is so important in preparing for this event, there was a decision that only one of us was going to be crushed by Neil. And I pulled the straw. At many points during the debate this evening and earlier, I wish this were general tutorial, because then I could hide behind Neil's answers and wouldn't have to engage in any way with the difficulty of responding to him. So I'm going now to try and make a few points in a very unconvincing way, but because I am the mouse that roared. So I'm going to begin with an Irish joke. This is the only possible way to actually enter into this debate at all. There's a story that an American couple were driving around the Irish countryside in a rented vehicle. And because road signs are, shall we say, less required in rural Ireland because everybody knows where everybody lives, they finally found some local clearly walking down the road with a straw in between his teeth. and whistling and happy in a way that no American could ever be in the whole course of their lives. And they stopped the car and said, "We need to get to Dublin." And he answered, "If I were going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here," which is, I believe, my entire relation to this debate. Now, there is something very important. We are celebrating 50 years of FYP, which I think is a remarkable fact. And I thank you for being part of that history and adding your own mustard and spice to what we do. But we are also a very traditional college, and therefore, except for when somebody made a mistake, I need Neil to hold up that top copy. We have been using the same translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh for 50 years. One year, the Penguin published a new edition by A.R. George, which is regarded as a definitive one. That was a mistake. We wanted the older Penguin traditions so that we could not ruin anybody's minds by showing there were certain complexities here. I think Maria and perhaps others mentioned the fact that we actually only have 2/3 of the epic. And even in 2015, new lines were discovered, 20 new lines, which changed the interpretation of the epic in the sense that Enkidu and Humbaba were apparently friends at some point, and that Humbaba was a king, and he enjoyed a life in the jungle. This is all evidence in these 20 lines. And so I understand the point that's made, which is that the epic was both lost and remains unfinished. And I do concede many of the points made by the government, the pro side, which is that we are able, therefore, in a sense, to finish the work of Gilgamesh ourselves. But we should also bear in mind that we actually have to make the quest to know the place for the first time. Everybody has kind of referred us to the four quartets by T.S. Eliot. You know, the trick is to return to your beginning, but knowing the place for the first time. And in order to do that, you actually have to make the whole journey through FYP to read the epic in the form in which the pro side has developed it for us. I need to add that, by the way, it can't be the Epic of Gilgamesh, because the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Babylonian, and the Assyrian have no word for epic. So what are we doing here exactly? We're puffing up something which they didn't even know was an epic. They regarded it as a life journey. Also, I add, probably his name wasn't Gilgamesh, but I'm obsessed with facts. Now, another thing I want to add when you are considering the motion, what about the Egyptians? Now, that was already destroyed for us because, as somebody explained, Egypt is just part of Club Med and therefore is not going to move us in the same direction. But I would like to make a case for the dispute of Ammon with his Ba, which is not so very different in time from the epic. And by the way, exists in only one single papyrus. When we got into this paper thing, what about papyrus? It exists in only one single papyrus and has the same content as the epic and speaks in a very precise way. I have to be very careful now to not over. Which of you have heard of Chat GPT? Well, do you know, if you asked Chat GPT to write an essay on the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first two words would be throughout history. And that's in a way, I think, what we got from the pro side. Throughout history, the Epic of Gilgamesh has provided fodder for students to write essays which perhaps you might not want to look at again. As an exercise in FYP, I sometimes have told students, put your first essay away in a drawer and look at it only after the orals in April. I've actually received a note from someone, I tried to find it, which said, I can't believe I handed in that twaddle. It's just disorganized, didn't seem to have a theme and so forth. And I feel a bit badly because we used the Epic of Gilgamesh as the first foray into essay writing. And we learned two things, We've learned two things from the epic, which I'll never forget. Throughout history, people have been concerned about love. Thank you for your essays. And then apparently also human beings, despite what I heard from the government, are very concerned about death also. And if I hadn't read those essays, I would never have known that. And thank you for allowing us to read the Epic of Gilgamesh.
This concludes the speakers portion of the evening. Now, maybe some among you have some burning questions that you would like to pose to any of our speakers before a decision is made. Oh, I already see hand. Wow. Okay. We will come to you with the single microphone that we have.
Well, that's close. Sorry about that. For the post-Gilgamesh side, there was the mention of a man in his ba. Do you then think that there is another text in the FYP list that should take the place of Gilgamesh as the most foundational, or arguing that there needs to be no one singular text, but instead looking at them all as a culmination of the foundation?
I will just repeat that for our live stream attendees. The question is that, the man in his ba was mentioned. Does the post-Gilgamesh side think that there's another text that should be considered the sort of beating heart and foundation, or are they rejecting this notion of a text to which everything else is a footnote altogether? The post-Gilgamesh side may answer.
I mean, I don't know if we all agree, but personally, I think that like I said in my speech, you have to take FYP as a whole because we read all the text together. Like, to take the heart metaphor, no one's talking about like cutting a heart out of a person and saying, this is great, We have to take the whole person. We have to take the whole thing. So I don't think that you could say another essay is the best or the most important or the center of FYP.
Well, I just, I'm a very pious person, as you know, and I take all questions seriously. But we had a colleague in FYP who was a very important member of the history of the program, even wrote a history of the program. And her position was that all the authors in FYP that we read subsequent to Plato are in some sense in dialogue with Plato. And the way we structured things, that was very clear, because the issue of justice was one that was a kind of thread that ran through everything, and is also, by the way, in, of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the unjust character of the tyrannical rule of Uruk. So I can only offer that. The reason it's possible to say that is it's such a rich text. The Plato's Republic seems to basically deal with every issue somehow or other that we wanted to address.
Wow. Quick question for Hilary. How long am I allowed to take with my question? Because I feel like I have like a whole 8 to 10 minutes for Pro-Gilgamesh, but I can cut it down a lot if you need.
Restrain yourself somewhat. I will
I'll
give
cut it
you
down.
some scope for your question.
Basically, I did write this down in a pretty succinct way because I had a feeling I wouldn't be able to go on forever. For Team Pro-Gilgamesh, you all did a lovely job of convincing me that Gilgamesh was first, but you've yet to clearly state as to why it should be seen as best. My question is whether there are any specific plot points, so not just general themes or ideas, within the epic that you think to point to it being worthy of the title of the heart of FYP, or if your argument is truly that Gilgamesh did it first, and because it was first, did it best.
Okay, this is a great question. So the question, I don't know if I need to be repeating this, but I'm going to do it anyway. The question is that our question asker is not convinced that the argument that Gilgamesh is first is a wholly compelling argument. So are there specific plot points rather than just general themes, the fact that Gilgamesh is first, so they're going to establish it as the true beating heart of the program? I turn it over to the pro-Gilgamesh side.
Okay, so the first thing that I think we would want to clarify is that when we say that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the heart of the program, we would bracket the question of best. I think this is not necessarily a claim about quality so much as, let's say, fruitfulness. But in answer to the question, are there specific plot points? I think that the Epic of Gilgamesh is a profound lesson in the fact that sometimes you and your friend need to have a little wrestle. Sometimes some problems must be solved with a little wrestling. This is a lesson you will, admittedly, you will find it elsewhere. It is not singular to the Epic of Gilgamesh. But it's a bold thing to claim. And it's crucial that we find it here in the form that we do. So Gilgamesh, for wrestling with your pals.
All right, so this question is specifically in regards to Neil's comments, but anyone from the pro-Gilgamesh side can respond. So Neil, you specifically said that you made reference to the fact that Gilgamesh was buried for many years. And you also made reference to the fact that Gilgamesh, coming from Asia and from kind of what we currently consider to be the beginnings of civilization, is thus, you know, could be considered the heart of FYP because of how we place it. But would that mean that Gilgamesh would lose its primacy of place if another text from another earlier civilization was revealed? And how are we defining civilization? Because surely there were works that have currently been lost to history, but you know, maybe they were passed down orally, and those works are still felt in cultures that are still surviving.
Thank you. These are wonderful questions. Again, the claim that we're making is not about inherent superiority or bestness or anything like that. We're making a kind of structural claim. You know, the heart is what pumps the other parts of your body. It's not necessarily the best part of your body. So the sense here is that, from my understanding, again, I'm no expert, the civilization in Mesopotamia by an edge was the first area that people will use the term civilization about. And again, from my understanding, the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest extant long verse poem. There are tens of thousands of tablets that have been unearthed in Mesopotamia. Almost all of them are dedicated towards recording supplies and business exchanges, and then you have this moment of this extraordinary poem that is kind of like a miracle preserved and present for us. So there may be other wonderful things that are on, and again, the point here is that it's preserved on clay, which meant that when a fire happened, rather than it being lost, it was hardened. And so certainly things that might be written in other forms or oral traditions, but they can't function foundationally precisely because of the difference of the mediums in which they are present. So this is just a structural claim, that to be a foundation, you want a foundation built in stone and clay.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. So this is mostly directed at Henry and Dr. Robertson, but based off my post 5 minutes of research and some past understanding, one of the major reasons clay was used over other writing methods at this time was that it can be washed away if it is not baked in fire and reused and reborn in a method. And this includes in foundations as well, like you just mentioned, which is why many buildings do still exist, but many also do not and have been washed away by the rivers. With that in mind, does the fact that they are written on clay really support their importance? And with that, does Gilgamesh's desire to be embodied in clay like Enkidu is, present his desire to be immortal, or does it represent his desire to be reborn like he is within the story as that clay is washed and then reused in future generations? And for example, it continues on with the monster from Frankenstein being created from the bodies of others and being reborn in heaven without flaws or without as many flaws as you had, and other examples my sleepy brain cannot think of.
Well, let me address the first part of that. Maybe not, I didn't necessarily bring this up in its entirety, but there's also best described as an aesthetic sensibility to clay. It's red, beautiful. One even thinks too, like with the advent of vinyl coming back, doesn't display, it's so much easier to just go on Spotify or one's phone, but we wonder why one goes to vinyl. And then I've even seen people selling cassettes which have the worst audio quality of all ways to listen to music. So one has to wonder too if clay doesn't communicate some ideas of beauty which perhaps are lost to us as well. But yeah, and then I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Robertson.
Yeah, I have a fantastic clay record collection that so you've made some wonderful interpretive points there about the ways in which clay functions, which for the Sumerians was a kind of proof that there were gods, which is to say that this substance, which in its natural given form has these marvelous capacities to be shaped and molded and formed, but has this terrible characteristic that equally all of that can disappear. But then when put into an oven, mysteriously, the fire that normally destroys becomes the means by which it is preserved. And of course, it's only because the Epic of Gilgamesh was on clay tablets that we have it today. The capacity for it to survive over that extraordinary length of centuries is because of the material in which it was found. And just a footnote, talking about footnotes, I was at a lecture just a little while ago by the new chair of Jewish studies, who was making this wonderful point about a phrase that was used when the Jewish people wanted to have something preserved. And they would say that it should be written in clay and in stone. And it's written in both because clay survives fire and stone survives water. And so it's interesting that while the tablets were on clay, what was being engraved in Uruk was the stone of the walls. Anyway, thanks.
Hi, just a quick question for Leah. It's a curiosity question. In your argument, you presume that the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh is male. How do you think that your perspective would shift if you presumed the author to be female? Or would it shift at all?
The authorship of the text doesn't necessarily mean that the representation of women within the text is going to be positive. As I stated, in Sumerian society, women did have significantly more rights, but they did not have the same rights as men. They did not perform scripture. They did not write things in clay like our Pro-Gilgamesh side has stated multiple times. So That's how I would address the first part, but the second part, yeah, the authorship of a text does not inherently mean it's going to be a feminist text, but it is a different perspective that we would see from it. So overall, the way that women are portrayed in the text, I think, is very indicative of the authorship and of the society it came from. And if it was a woman, it would be at least a different sort of lens to it. But at this point, it is a man, so.
I'm not sure to which side I'm speaking. Much of the debate this evening has been about immutability, and the foundation year program itself is mutable. I speak as someone who did it in 1976, which is before many of your parents were born. And it was when there were no women authors in the curriculum. And further, as has been made by Father Curran and by Dr. Robertson as well, through Whitehead, learning stopped with Plato and Aristotle, and everything else was a footnote. And that was the prevailing argument of the foundation year program. Gilgamesh was never referenced after the first 2 weeks of the course. Plato was referenced by the time we got to George Grant, which in those days is when the foundation year program ended. So I'm just suggesting that perhaps the heart has been transplanted from Plato to Gilgamesh.
Can I just say something about that? I would like everybody to know that the resolution changed. So the one that we were sent was actually, be it resolved that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the high point of the FYP year, not the heart, and everything else that follows is a mere footnote. So I think there's a difference between high point and heart, and people are now increasingly making points about it being the heart, when I think we were working with a different resolution initially.
Yeah, and I'd love to speak to this idea of the heart too, because like I didn't do very well in bio in high school, but one thing I think I understand, someone correct me if I'm wrong, about the heart is that you can't like take it out of you and still be okay. So I think we need to ask ourselves, like, could we remove Gilgamesh? And like the answer is kind of yeah, you know, like it's not coming up again and again in the same way that Plato is. Like, if you were reading Pico and you didn't know who Plato was, you'd be like, why does this guy keep referencing this old philosopher? Who cares, right? So purely by the virtue of the fact that it could be removed way easier than other things, it seems to not be the heart.
Is there any hard evidence to suggest that Reverend Dr. Thomas Curran is not the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh?
No.
I think we should have a committee investigate this question.
A question for Jonah from the Post-Gilgamesh side. Hi, Jonah. I was interested in the fact that you mentioned that you don't believe Gilgamesh is a relatable protagonist. Do you believe his relationship with Enkidu, you know, humanizes him at all, or like adds anything to his characterization, specifically in regard to the wrestling point that Tim Clarke brought up? Do you think there's any validity to that?
For those of you who don't know, Gabe is my roommate. Here's the thing. I'm not gonna say that like wrestling with your bros isn't relatable. Like I've also been bored in class and like we were like, let's go study in another room, and then started Fight Club. That's actually a real story. I'm not sure how I got onto this track. But at the end of the day, like someone's relatable if my personal belief about characters is like they're relatable if you could imagine a day about them that isn't related to this story. You know, like you can imagine what they're thinking when they're like making bread in the kitchen or when they're going to sleep or when they're like staring out a window a little bit bored. So I think that like Gilgamesh has all these external things that makes him relatable. He does the same things that we do. And I'm not going to say he's not relatable at all, but he doesn't have that sort of like internal essence that I think makes people relatable and lets us relate to each other.
I think I should just point out that we mentioned Hegel way more than we mentioned Gilgamesh. Even when we haven't read Hegel for whatever reason, we're mentioning Hegel. So truly isn't the heart of the foundation your program like the second last thing we read?
Absolutely.
Well, I just think they're the same thing.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, if there are a couple more out there. I think so.
A point that was brought up on the post-Gilgamesh side, but not really mentioned on the pro side, was that if Gilgamesh is a foundational text of FYP and everything else that follows is a footnote, how do women that are written in text like Dido and feminist writers like Wollstonecraft factor into this idea?
No comment. No, I'm kidding. Well, something that this side brought up that I was thinking about is Queen Elizabeth and how, you know, how are they related? But Gilgamesh is a human that's divinized, or however you say that word, just like Queen Elizabeth is. So there's a parallel right there for you. And as for like, you know, the lack of powerful women in Gilgamesh, Ishtar kills Enkidu, I think, which is like pretty awesome of her. So I don't really see what the big deal is. If
I have a very quick question for the pro-Gilgamesh side. I'm just wondering if you could define what the difference is to you between Gilgamesh being the first text and the heart of the rest of the program, because it feels like you're just using them interchangeably for the most part.
Well, we have metaphor problems because we've got both heart, which is sort of a structural image of the center that feeds everything else, and we have the footnote image, which suggests that there's a main text that the footnotes are. And so what we're trying to do is make a structural argument in which being first and at the same time the source and basis of everything that follows are interconnected thoughts. So we're using the firstness to make a larger point about the way in which everything derives from that first beginning. Does that help? Okay, I'm glad I convinced you.
I think it's no secret that the FYP program has a lot of religious bias, specifically towards Christianity. I don't know if you guys have noticed, we've read a lot of Christian inspired books. And I was wondering if you guys could speak on the fact that, you know, Gilgamesh wasn't mentioned. Sorry, this is for the post-Gilgamesh side, that Gilgamesh wasn't mentioned in most of our books, but Christianity was. And this seems to be more because of how the FYP program is structured. And is it less, this discussion, is it more to do with the specific structuring of the program or actual literature itself?
I'm not sure I want to answer that, but I would like to hold out for the Egyptians again, who I think have a more coherent theology than what we're presented with in this Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian text. And, you know, if your thing is to get to know Ishtar a bit better, I'd like to warn you against it. But I want to make another comment. I want to pick up Meredith's point. I couldn't hear everything you said, but I think I got the gist of it. And I'm amazed my colleague who has lectured on Hegel this year in foundation year program didn't bring up something that Hegel does say, and I think is very helpful. I should add that he did not write this text, so it has that relation to Gilgamesh. It's the work of many hands. It may represent his views, but it's based on some lecture notes, but mostly recordings that were made by hand by students at his lectures. He lectured on it 6 times, and this work is presented as if it were coherent. He is a genius, and therefore I can assure you that he did not say the same thing 6 times over in a row. He's not an FYP tutor. Not going to say any more about that, but just let me read this very short passage, which I think is at the heart of the argument that the pro side was making. He says, that the working out in history of what is potential is the purpose of the lectures. And he says, there's a quotation, just as the germ of the plant carries within itself the entire nature of the tree, even the taste and shape of its fruit, so the first traces of spirit virtually contain all history, which I think is actually your argument in some respects. I just want to say, because I'm a cynic, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is.
I think we'll probably, but I think there's a response from the pro-Gilgamesh side.
Oh, well, just as it informs the discussion about Christianity and Judaism and FYP, one thinks of the biblical story in which Moses comes down from Mount Sinai. What is he holding but clay tablets? He sees the Israelites dancing around a bull, the emblematic image of the Assyrians and the Akkadians. And it's entirely likely that they had a copy of Gilgamesh with them. And it's upon seeing the superiority of the Gilgamesh tablets that Moses broke his very own. So there's something to inform the situation.
Okay, friends, the time has come. The speakers have spoken, the questions have been posed and responded to, and now the decision rests in your hands. So I am going to say each team, and after I say that team, I need you to react with gusto for the team that you support, and you and only you will determine the winner. So there's great power resting in your hands right now. Are you ready to determine the winner? We have the cup ready to be presented. Okay. All right, everyone, silence. Thank you. Do you support Team Pro-Gilgamesh? Wow. I ask again, do you support now anti-Gilgamesh? I am astounded. I don't think there's ever been such noise in this room, ever. I am just the moderator. I am going to leave the decision with the foundation year program director, Dr. Daniel Brandis. I know, I'm so sorry. It is up to Daniel Brandis to award the FIP Cup. Is it going to be? Based on that reaction, I cannot decide. So I am going to defer to the wisdom of Daniel Brandis, FIP director, and he will announce the winner.
That's just terrible. You're fired. No, obviously this is a very difficult decision to make. Both sides made riveting, stirring arguments. If I had had an opportunity, I had a question, but I would have asked Elle, how dare you? Anyway, let me say this. I couldn't have enjoyed this event more. I thought that was thrilling. I thought all of you did wonderfully. I thought the questions were terrific. I didn't stop beaming the whole time. I'm not enjoying this part as much because I would have cheered for both sides. This is impossible. So bear in mind, right? It's just a mug. So I'm wanting to congratulate everyone. I say this as a preface because a decision will have to be made. We can't be namby-pamby about this thing. So I'm now going to suggest to you that I couldn't tell the difference in the volume between the two sides. I did get the sense, though, that there was a more evenly distributed cheer and embrace of the pro-Gilgamesh. Let me just say this. In addition to thanking all of the participants again for a terrific evening, I want to remind everyone that the slate of FIP at 50 events will continue in early April. Our next event is a trivia night to which everyone is invited. That should be equally raucous and bawdy. Maybe not equally, but should also be terrific fun. Thank you all very, very much for making this a terrific night. Thank you all.